What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and I have two guests today whose work on defense issues from a critical perspective I admire a great deal. William Hartung, Bill Hartung, he's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, but I've been following him for what seems like my entire career. And most of that, he was at the Center for International Policy doing God's work. And then my second guest, Julia Gledhill, is an analyst at the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. And she's also like omnipresent in my Twitter feed, tracking the minutia of war profiteering and defense industrial bloat and the like. And Bill and Julia have a tandem piece that's really smart in The Nation magazine. It was cross-posted at Tom Dispatch, and it's called "The Pentagon Won Big with the Debt Ceiling Bill." Surprise, surprise. So we're gonna talk about that piece. But both of these guys have been on the anti-militarist defense beat for a while, and I've been wanting to do a deep dive on fighting the good fight against Pentagon Graft. And so these are kind of the perfect guests. So Julia, Bill, thanks for coming on the show. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having us.
So I'm hoping this episode is going to be a kind of education for listeners about, how precisely the military primacy machine is the way it is, like not just gratuitously large, but gratuitously unaccountable. It almost goes without saying dangerous also. And I have to say up front, there's a little bit of like leading the witness that's going to happen here, because even though I'm a pretty loud critic of the national security state, I started out life doing force planning and defense strategy in the Obama years. And so some of the themes that we're talking about here have made their way into the show before, but we never had guests on to talk about this stuff in any kind of detail. So to start with the piece in The Nation and maybe set the scene a little bit, what 5,000 foot view, what was the debt ceiling fight? Where do we stand now? How was it resolved? Where does the Pentagon fit into this?
Julia, do you want to take a shot or should I start?
Sure. I'm happy to set the stage and please add on. So obviously the United States hit its debt ceiling in January of this year. It was about $31.5 trillion. This is the money that the government is allowed to borrow to pay its bills. So if we don't do something about the debt limit when we reach it, we will default. And that is a huge cost to taxpayers because it, really impacts interest rates for folks to borrow money. Congress spent the following 6 months arguing about how to deal with reaching said debt limit. The Biden admin was pressing for a clean increase to the debt ceiling, while House Republicans were really pushing for spending cuts along with work requirements for social programs like Medicaid and for food stamps, in addition to programs like temporary assistance for needy families. So a lot of the kind of controversies that have come up in past debt ceiling fights, including in 2013 and 2011, resurfaced. This was a major obstacle for House Speaker McCarthy. Obviously, it was very difficult to move that deal forward. But essentially, the deadline was early June when the Treasury Department said that the government would run out of money potentially. Congress cut it pretty close, and Biden signed a deal just 2 days before the Treasury Department predicted we could run out of money that suspended government spending, with the exception of defense, allowing us to spend money on the Pentagon that the Biden administration had requested. So, the CBO had estimated that this deal would reduce budget deficits by about $1.5 trillion over the next decade. But obviously, there is a major loophole in that deal, which Bill and I wrote about, and I will hand over to him to talk about.
That was beautiful overview. I'm going to do some of the gossipy stuff. When the 15 rounds of votes to get McCarthy as speaker, Freedom Caucus said, we want a budget freeze or we're not going to vote for you. And so there was this assumption, oh, they're going to freeze it across the board. And the military industrial complex was freaking out and making press statements. Peace movement was mildly hopeful. And then Chip Roy, one of the folks in the caucus, said, oh, no, we didn't talk about, freezing defense, implying that all the cuts would have to come from the domestic side, which would have been cut some programs by as much as a third. So then there was backlash against that. So some people like Jim Jordan and eventually McCarthy said, oh, no, defense is on the table. But it was barely on the table because, when asked what they would cut, they said, oh, the woke agenda. Like, they're going to lay off diversity coordinators or something. But then they also said, well, spending on alternative energy at the Pentagon is part of the woke agenda. They said, well, maybe we could close some military bases and maybe there's too many generals. And so it added up to maybe 5 or 10 billion out of 800 billion plus. So it wasn't enough to, for parity and cuts. And then as Julie said, the final deal, they didn't touch the Pentagon at all. It was the amount that Biden has requested. And instead of going back to 2022 levels for domestic, they went to 2023. So it wasn't quite as harsh, but it's still quite unfair. And then finally, the loophole, which is that although there's this alleged ceiling on the Pentagon, things that are viewed as emergency or for overseas contingencies are not constrained, as the CBO said. So there's going to be probably a fight soon about whether there'll be an emergency package that will add more to the Pentagon, possibly linked up with the next Ukraine package.
So there's a theoretical cap on defense spending, but that cap accommodates next year's $886 billion budget, the largest ever. And that's not even where the limit is. But the debt ceiling deal does put hard constraints and actual cuts on other discretionary spending, like non-defense spending. Does that capture it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, some members have said, well, if you're going to increase the Pentagon, you should increase some other things. So there may be a fight about that if there's an emergency package. But I don't know, Julia, how do you think it's going to play out?
I think that we are likely to see a supplemental very soon, and it's going to be OCO 2.0, as Bill and I wrote. And we just got rid of the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund in 2022. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it ended up being.
Can you actually break out what that is real quick? What is OCO? How does it function as a loophole for defense to actually be like much higher than it is?
Yeah, so OCO stands for Overseas Contingency Operations Funding. The name itself implies that the fund allegedly, purportedly, was supposed to be used for, like on the ground needs, for things that service members needed urgently on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was created post 9/11 as this sort of like emergency fund, again, for what were supposed to be sort of emergent needs. It turned into more of a base budget funding mechanism, and post 2011 Budget Control Act, it really turned into this slush fund wherein Congress could increase military spending while averting the discretionary spending caps that were established by the 2011 Budget Control Act, which again was a product of another debt ceiling debacle. And I mean, this isn't just anecdotal. We do know that this turned into kind of a base budget slush fund, in part because the Congressional Budget Office helped us unveil that. They estimated in 2006 that about 71% of OCO funding was for on-the-ground needs like operations and force protection, while in 2019, only 32% of OCO funding supported those types of temporary activities. And then the 2022 budget request from President Biden was the first one that did not include this type of OCO funding. But the Congressional Research Services also reported that Congress appropriated over $2 trillion through emergency requirements or through OCO between 2001 and 2019, which is about 9.5% of total discretionary spending during that time period. So OCO was a very significant funding path for much of the past 2 decades.
And the hawks claim that the Budget Control Act devastated Pentagon spending, but because of OCO, they actually spent as much in the 10 years of the BCA as the prior 10 years. And the prior 10 years were the peaks of Iraq and Afghanistan, 200,000 troops overseas. So the Pentagon did just fine, but the mythology is that somehow this, irreparably harmed them, and we've got to play catch up and throw a bunch more money at them.
Yeah, so in the BCA in the Budget Control Act days, when we were supposed to be taking like $500 billion of defense cuts over 10 years, that was when I sat in defense strategy in the Pentagon, and like part of our job at that time was to try and think through alternative defense strategies. Not really alternatives, and we didn't do it, but alternative defense strategies given a presumption of, Pentagon austerity, basically. Like the trend line that we thought we were working within, the constraint was 500 billion over 10 years and even more. Like it was just that there was going to be downward pressure on the defense budget as an operating assumption. And it didn't take long before we realized that the OCO account, like this emergency slush fund, was actually a way to like absorb a lot of the excess spending, or like it was a way out, like to avoid hard choices. And so like in a way, OCO prevented us from contemplating anything other than military primacy, and so like we had actual conversations where we would try to like game out what might be able to reasonably go into OCO instead of part of the normal budget, which had a cap on it, and that's obviously a shitty game to play, and I'm sorry.
I have a feeling you weren't calling the shots, but
Yeah, no, I was just an agent of Empire or whatever. In the piece you guys wrote, you warned that unless something drastic changes, the defense budget is going to increase further even than 886 billion, right? Like we could be seeing the big $1 trillion defense budget. What makes you say that? Is it the fact that like OCO is back, that there's this new emergency, not new, but the old emergency fund mechanism is back in place? Is there other reasons to think that?
Well, Congress has shown a great appetite for adding to the Pentagon's request in recent years. There was 25 billion added one year, then 45 billion, which may be some of the highest levels ever. I haven't really gone back and tracked, but huge amounts of add-ons. And now they'll have to do it a little more stealthily. They'll have to put it in the emergency supplementals, but there seems to be a strong urge to do that. And then, of course, China as the pacing threat. If you really say, we want to be able to win a war with China in their front yard, the sky's the limit of what you would spend. And even then, there's no telling how it would turn out, given that it's two nuclear armed powers. But anyway, that's a huge kind of magnet for them, unlike, say, Afghanistan, which wasn't really helping the Navy and other services as much.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys have figures for this, but the amount that we spend on security assistance to Ukraine, it's a shitload in real dollars, but it's tiny compared to the overall defense budget because of the magnitude of it. You have a way to account for why Ukraine, like why spending on Ukraine can't just come out of the $886 billion budget? Why do we need emerge? What is the budget? I guess it's for China warfighting. Can you answer the question, please, before I get angry at myself?
Well, Julia should add to this, but I think there's a couple things. One is, they can't predict, given the war, how much they're going to spend in a year, but they could have put in an amount and then added to it. But I think keeping it separate is good for marketing. It's like, who wouldn't want to arm Ukraine? Well, I mean, some people would, but in the broad, popular mind. And so I think that's part of it. And then the other part is well, if they put it in the Pentagon budget, what if it has to come at the expense of something else in there? Where they start making trades. So I think those are the main reasons that I think it's happening that way, but Julie may have others.
Well, as you say, Van, the Pentagon loves to avoid hard decisions, and I think that emergency supplementals allow them to, skirt those decisions entirely. And as Bill and I have written previously before, Ukraine spending, regardless of what you think about it, will have likely a long-lasting impact on the industry itself. And I think that we're starting to see this conversation of ramping up production capacity, as Bill mentioned, sort of being transferred to this conversation about China and near peer competition and the pacing threat, which is interesting to me because I'm pretty sure China doesn't want a ground war with us. It would be incredibly destructive to both countries, and I'm not quite sure how increasing production capacity is going to fare well for either of us. But I think that is something to consider as well, just because Congress has sort of used the capacity challenges of the defense industry to justify this emergency spending and say, like, we need this right now in order to produce the weapons for Ukraine and then also somewhat manifest this war with China. And once those manufacturers are at that production capacity, they will do everything in their power to maintain that production capacity. And I think that that's something that we should all think a lot about.
Yeah, there's a permanent war economy problem here. Can you talk? I was going to ask about this later, but you mentioned it already. Can you talk about China as a pacing threat? The Pentagon, we started using those terms in my day. Like, what does that mean for defense spending, for the defense industry, for strategy?
Well, the Defense Secretary Austin has said that it means China is the only country that can systemically challenge us in all domains, economically, technologically, politically, militarily. Y'all know this, but the DoD's response is basically, let's play to our strength. Let's, stress integrated deterrence, the cornerstone of our national defense strategy, which is, deterring aggression conventionally via land, air, sea, but also space and cyber and informational spheres. But, in my mind, I think, and Bill and I also wrote this, we would actually decrease our budget if we saw China as this pacing threat, because we significantly outspend them. And because if you look at their actual capabilities, they have an inherently defensive strategy. We talk a lot about maritime capabilities and expanding our naval fleet and hitting this 381 ship threshold. But frankly, we are retiring ships before they reach maturity because we are developing them prematurely. And China's naval fleet is designed to play defense. Their ships can't really operate more than a few hundred kilometers away from their borders. And I think that nobody wants to talk about that in Washington. It's a major problem. And I think that we should probably focus on managing the budget that we already have and protecting the assets that we already have than we should on expanding for the sake of expansion. That is not actually meeting China as a pacing threat. It is actually ignoring China's real position militarily and strategically, and I think it's a bit dim. And it really just speaks to industry's influence on defense policy, right? Like, more money doesn't solve all of our problems, and I think that we're kind of getting lost in that.
It's such rhetorical jujitsu. Pacing threat. We're the dominant power, man.
Right.
We should be like, that was the thing that was remarkably sound about what you guys were arguing. I've said versions of this too. If we're indexing ourselves to them, we need to scale down dramatically our defense force posture.
Yeah. Simpler, cheaper weapons and strategy. Like, they know exactly what they want. They have vision, and we just build to build so that corporations can make money effectively.
That's radical. But I tend to agree. there was an interesting congressional study at the time of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. They, they impaneled a commission which was chock full of former military, contractor personnel, people from think tanks who were drowning in contractor money. And lo and behold, they said the Pentagon strategy wasn't tough enough. They needed to spend more money, and they picked the number 3 to 5% real growth, which was cherry picked from an aside. Jim Mattis said at a hearing. There was no big study, no big kind of backup to it, but it became a rallying cry for the hawks in Congress. And Jim Inhofe, who's was the key Republican in Senate Armed Services, used to wave this report at hearings and say, "Don't you agree with this report, sir?" And whether they'd read it or not, they usually saluted his flag and said yes. So the industry's been onto this well before the war on terror hasn't ended, but it's been kind of superseded in priority. So it's they sort of see this as this is like the perfect foil, because if you need a big navy, you need long range missiles, you need a nuclear arsenal. It just justifies a lot more kinds of weaponry than dealing with the Taliban or something like that.
Yeah. There's a cottage industry of like military, well, you do know this, of like military pundit types who like literally right now are saying that we need to massively increase defense spending, right? This is so asinine that I literally don't know what to do with it. What do you say to that kind of argument? What do you say to those people?
Well, when we talk to them, yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of it is, and Julie's done a ton of work on this, more money is not likely to produce more defense capability anyway, because of price gouging, because the big companies are throwing a lot of money into buying back their own shares to pump up stock prices, because of the way they pay their executives and so forth. So, and because there's only about 5 major contractors anymore, the Pentagon's kind of over a barrel, because if Lockheed Martin is screwing up the F-35, what are they going to do? So I think more is not more in terms of actual defense, and then also it's a question of strategy, which rarely gets discussed in Washington. That they'll say, "Oh, if we cut it, we have to change our strategy," as if that's a bad thing.
Yeah, like as if our strategy's good.
Yeah, and so it's like, well, the current strategy broadly, expressed is have to win a war with Russia or China, have to intervene against Iran or North Korea, maintain the war on terror, which Biden pointed out in his speech pulling out of Afghanistan, that, well, there's terrorism all over the world. We need to refocus. He wasn't saying this is the end of this tactic. So if you're going to do all those things and spend $2 trillion, redoing your nuclear arsenal over a couple decades, and you keep hiring more and more private contractors who are very expensive, but it's not really clear what some of them are doing, you end up with a huge Pentagon budget. And if you're really going to reduce it, you have to reduce your force structure, which means a less ambitious strategy. And that conversation's rarely had. I mean, the NDAA, they talked about all these horrific House amendments, kind of the racist, transphobic,
anti-woke stuff,
misogynist stuff that now they want to get out of there. But nobody talked about, are we spending enough? Do we have the right strategy? Are these weapons aligning with any strategy? And that was almost completely absent. So the job that they're allegedly elected to do didn't happen.
Yeah, there's a subtext in a lot of what both of you guys write that I like strongly agree with. Maybe it's a text too, I don't know. But it's basically that like it's the largesse of the defense budget itself. It's the avoiding hard choices in strategy that is perpetuating bad strategy. And there's the flip side of that, or the theory implied there, is that like if we could have some fucking fiscal discipline, I curse a lot, I'm sorry, then there's actually like a reasonable chance that we might get a much better defense strategy on the other side. Like it might force us, like a writer doesn't just stare at a blank page. They have to have constraints to work with in order to create something great, you know? Maybe a better defense strategy will come out of actual discipline for once, which we've never had.
Yeah, I mean, I think in writing, brevity is really powerful, right? If you can use fewer words, you should. And I think a similar case could be made for the budget, right? Like if it's a little bit smaller, it's going to be more effective, more targeted. You're going to have to make harder decisions. You're going to have to prioritize, just like the rest of us. The rest of us aren't buying every single thing we want. Consumers have to make hard choices, so our legislators should too. And to address your initial question about, you know, how do you respond to people who say that we need more money to you know, meet China as a pacing threat? Well, Austin himself has said that, you know, meeting China as a pacing threat means competing with them economically and technologically and politically and militarily. Well, this is not my idea. I will have to credit my very smart colleague Dan Grazier, who's written a very long report on our nonsensical plans in regards to China threat inflation and the way that the defense establishment is responding to, you know, this new era of near peer competition, great power competition, but sinking all of our money in a department that has failed 5 consecutive audits, can account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets, is probably not great for our economy, especially because defense is not the best jobs producing industry there is. We know that. Legislators don't appear to care about that. Education and healthcare are much better. So if we're talking about economic competition, increasing spending on a military that doesn't deliver more security per like dollar spent, which is generous, I think, on my part, it isn't good for economic competition. I feel pretty confident in saying that.
Yeah, and the Pentagon soaks up a lot of the industry, a lot of science and engineering talent that might be applied to other problems.
Yeah. Cost of War project at Brown has great data about the opportunity cost of defense spending, and it's horrific. Like the amount of self-imposed damage that gets unacknowledged and uncalculated because of defense spending. It's I mean, there's a way in which like it's why we have such a large precarious class in the United States. I guess back up a second. I wanted to go back to the debt ceiling deal thing real quick. We had a notorious debt ceiling deal in the Obama days. You guys sort of referenced it, 2011, 2013. Can you sort of talk through how Biden's debt ceiling deal compares with the Obama years? It seems to me like Democrats got absolutely screwed both times, but I mean, you could say that they're just bad negotiators or they're just corrupt or I don't know what. Like, what's your take on that? Like Biden to Obama debt ceiling comparison?
Well, the Biden deal was 10 years, and this is 2 years, so that's a big difference. And before they made the deal, there was a commission before the Budget Control Act, Simpson-Bowles, which included some people, union leaders and more progressive defense analysts, who said, well, if you're going to do this, if you're going to have these reduction targets, you have to treat the Pentagon equally. So they fought for that, and it was a good fight to have. But then, the OCO slush fund diminished that a bit. But nonetheless, Congress did have a little leverage to say, if you're going to increase the Pentagon, you have to increase domestic, which kind of took a lot of liberal Democrats off the playing field in terms of going after the Pentagon, because they were just playing the game of parity. Like, all right, the Pentagon's going to get another $30 billion. We want another $30 billion for domestic programs, and they would slug it out. The Pentagon would get a little more, but it was still leverage for domestic to get a little more. And then even in OCO, they put some State Department money in there. So other people who otherwise might criticize OCO were like, well, state's going to get hammered if OCO goes away. So it was a complicated fight. I think this deal is almost worse because there's they basically gave it away at the outset, and they didn't touch the Pentagon, and then the freeze and the cuts and domestic were baked in. So I think possibly it's the worst deal even.
Yeah, I mean, by the numbers, the raw number, 886 billion, like that should be a leading indicator of the quality of, subjecting defense to any kind of discipline. Um, the actual and the budget figure that we end up with, which is probably going to end up being north of 886, but that is itself like a grand number. Could you put that in historical perspective or like in relation to other countries or something, like so that it's just not a raw number?
Well, it's about 10 times, or the next 10 countries combined would add up to that. And many of them are US allies. And then historically, it's a couple $100 billion higher than like the peak of the Vietnam War, Korean War, height of the Cold War. So it's quite a bit more, and it's a smaller force. Granted, they're paid a little better, but
Mm-hmm.
they're spending huge amounts of money for a smaller military that's doing, in some cases, less, in some cases, much more than it should be. So they're just sitting on a lot of money, and a lot of it's getting wasted. And of course, there's the congressional angle. Even when the Pentagon wants to get rid of something, Congress won't let them. There's ships that don't work, and there's planes they want to retire, and there's bases they'd like to close. So the Pentagon budget becomes almost like a sedimentary rock. You can just go down and see, oh, this is from this era, this is from this era, this is from this era, and nothing ever goes away. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but that's kind of the process.
Yeah, that reminds me that the F-35 itself, which has become like this symbolic boondoggle of boondoggles, and like it it only came online in the 21st century, but it was initially a requirement to fight the Soviets in the 80s. Like it was nurtured over the decades, but like its purpose was long since overtaken by world historical events. And then we get it. And then on top of that, you have all the dysfunctions and cost overruns and time delays and everything else. But it's like, man, like the this whole like sedimentary rock the analogy is genuinely accurate. It's disconcerting. One of the arguments for defense spending to be as high as it is that there's just no alternative, right? There is no alternative is like the ultimate shutdown of debate point, seems like at all times. Like if America is going to be capable of defending allies, there's no alternative. We got to do primacy, basically. And there's problems with that reasoning on its own terms, but it's also not true that there's no alternative. The People Over Pentagon Act is what I have in mind here. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, happy to. It is a bill from Representatives Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan, who are kind of the House champions on cutting the Pentagon budget.
Mm-hmm.
It would cut $100 billion from the Pentagon budget while keeping safe service member pay and the Defense Health Program. And it would give, honestly, the Pentagon a lot of discretion on how to cut that money, which has attracted some critiques from folks in the budget space. But I see it as a way to, again, force the Pentagon to make hard decisions surrounding their budget when, for the past several years. Instead, they've been able to ask for their heart's desire, plus a bunch of extra wish list items outside of the budget process, which we can talk a little bit about. But I see it as a really encouraging path toward cutting the budget in the sense that it is the main vehicle of building congressional support for decreasing military spending.
Yeah, I don't. It's so hard to argue against the People Over Pentagon Act, given that it actually preserves the sort of human welfare part of defense spending,
Right.
and it doesn't even require an alternative like it doesn't jeopardize the existing bullshit strategy. Like you could still make a claim to global primacy, even though we should be challenging that too. But like you could still have that basic orientation under the constraints of the People Over Pentagon Act and you might do something for, the national interest. I don't know. You guys have both talked about, I can't remember if you mentioned it in this Nation piece, but the unfunded priorities list, or like sometimes it's called the unfunded requirements list.
Mhm.
Can you talk about what this is and how it ends up inflating the defense budget?
Oh yeah, Julia's golden on this. You should do that.
Okay, I will set us up at the very least. Yeah, so the Pentagon is required by law to submit to Congress these extra budgetary wish lists. Now, they haven't always been required by law to do so. They've been doing it informally since the 90s, but they weren't required to provide these wish lists until just a few years ago. Separate military components, as well as all of the services, submit to Congress these individual wish lists. And it's basically like, these are weapon systems that we didn't think were important enough to include in our base budget request, but we would very much like them for shits and gigs, essentially. And so that we can flex, I guess. And this year, those lists total at least 17 billion. Last year, they were over 24 billion. And in fact, last year was a hallmark year in that the Pentagon submitted a collection of not just one, huge consolidated wish list, unfunded priority list, but two unfunded priority lists. As you say, they've been kind of rebranded by supporters as unfunded requirements, but they are not in fact requirements because they are not in the base budget request, which means that they don't require the same budget justification documents. The Defense Department doesn't have to indicate like how this is going to impact defense spending in the long term. It's called the Future Defense Years Program. Did I get that right, Bill? Future Years Defense?
FYDP,
Yeah.
FYDP.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Everybody did not understand you. Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, budget a lot. I will just say, and I won't ramble about this for much longer, but they're messed up for a number of reasons. First, they completely distort the budget process, which is already so strained. Let's say that. But they're also inaccessible to the public for the most part. There are like two taxpayer groups that follow this closely. There are some defense outlets that get their hands on these wish lists every single year. But for budget watchers like Bill and me, it is hard to actually match up like, okay, did the 45 billion added to the budget last year match up with the unfunded priority lists? Like, we don't know that because we don't have all of them. They are not made public. So we have bits and pieces that we puzzle together, and that's why our estimates are like at least or more than, which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, it's not like Health and Human Services or HUD has an unfunded priority list saying, oh yeah, we're not meeting all the needs of homeless people, so give us an extra X amount. It's only the Pentagon that gets to do this.
That is the thing that is the most messed up about this. It's like, if this was a government-wide practice, I could see, okay, the Pentagon can exploit the mechanism the same way that Health and Human Services can exploit it or something, but that's totally not the case. This is a unique carve-out that lets generals go, direct to Congress basically and lobby without appearing partisan. Lobbying for sectional interests, literally, Yeah, that's pretty messed up.
I would be remiss not to mention that earlier this spring was a statement from Secretary Austin in support of repealing the statutory requirements for these wish lists. It was a huge freaking deal. It's the biggest pushback on wish lists that we've seen since the 2000s. And Congress, Congress hasn't done anything to get rid of these statutory requirements. And Jayapal and, Warren are really great on this. Jayapal has, and McClintock and a few other House members introduced a bill to repeal the legal requirements for these wish lists, but all efforts to repeal them through the Defense Policy Bill, through the NDAA, failed. In fact, the Jayapal amendment didn't even make it past Rules, which is the gatekeeper of all amendments that are voted on the floor in the annual Defense Policy Bill deliberation process. So, there are people in Congress that care about this, but on the whole, the Pentagon came out in support of repealing those requirements, and nothing has happened, which is insane. Lawmakers really love to cherry pick when to listen to the Defense Department, depending on whether it's convenient for them or not.
Yeah, selective hearing. Yeah, when for a little while when I was in the Pentagon, I worked for Bob Gates, who was Secretary of Defense, who was no hero of mine, but he did have a level of competency that was higher than some of his like predecessors and successors. And one of the things, the only thing he did that I would actually cheer for today is that he did prevent for like a very short period of time, I think maybe like 1 year or 18 months, maybe not even that, he issued an order to the Pentagon and to the joint staff and to the services to like not be allowed to provide unfunded priorities lists to Congress. And the language around it was a little fuzzy because there's a requirement to provide these lists or whatever, basically. But he's just like, look, if you're uniformed services, you don't go to Congress without coordinating with my Leg Affairs office and with getting my staff, OSD, to basically vet what you're going to put forward. And so in effect, it's like, well, we'll provide these unfunded wish lists, but it's going to be with civilian control of the military. That's a pretty like small, not a big thing, like that doesn't transform anything. And obviously the arc of history on Pentagon spending, it hasn't done shit, it hasn't affected anything. But at least for like a little while, it was a proof of concept to me that like an assertive Secretary of Defense could just do this. They could be, if they're smart enough and their heart is actually in trying to prevent this kind of like circumvention of authority and trying to constrain the defense budget, they could put in place some kind of mechanism and use their authorities to prevent the services from going to Congress and doing this military-industrial complex thing.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it scaled them back by like 90%. For a very short period of time. I want to say it was like 2009, but I could totally be wrong. But you're right, Van, that very little has changed. You referenced the permanent war economy a while ago, and very little has changed since Seymour Millman wrote that book, which is so depressing.
Yeah, I studied with Seymour. This is why I got into this mess.
No shit. I've like recently discovered him, and it's a treasure of a resource, man.
Yeah, he was interesting because he originally came at it from an engineering point of view. And just how affecting the larger economy. I'm not sure every one of his statements plays out, but it was such a breath of fresh air at the time,
Yeah, that's so cool, Bill. Reading his books in college changed my life.
Well, otherwise I was a philosophy major, so I had no content in my head at all. So this was a good thing.
I kind of want to like just mention a word and wind you guys up and see how you respond. Defense contractor lobbying. What do you want to say about this? Why is it a problem?
Well, we'll do a 1-2 punch. Well, I mean, it's corrupt. I mean, basically,
it's literal corrupt. Yeah,
they want to line their pockets. They want to pay their executives more. They want their shares to go higher, and they're willing to do anything. I mean, it's legalized corruption, unfortunately. So they give tens of millions to Congress on lobbying. They hire former elected executive branch officials to lobby for them. They've got 800 lobbyists now, at least, more than one for every member of Congress. They fund think tanks that take tough lines on this stuff. And, the causation is hard to know. Are they funding them because they're tough think tanks, or are the think tanks getting tougher because this is where they're getting their money? I think that's hard to plumb. But anyway, so they've got think tanks, they've got campaign contributions, they've got lobbying, they've got the revolving door. They're often involved in studies for the Pentagon about what our strategy should be or how we should develop certain technologies. So their decisions help line their own pockets going forward. And I think they also are somewhat involved in the generalized campaign of fear that gets people to support large budgets to begin with. And they've become kind of like little heroes because of Ukraine. The head of Lockheed Martin was on one of the Sunday shows, and they were like, how do you do what you do? I mean, it must be really tough,
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. It was like a little infomercial for Lockheed Martin. And, I think, Ukraine must be defended, and we have to supply them, and we have the industry we have. but they are trying to use it to burnish their image, say they're the arsenal of democracy, which the people of Yemen would be, surprised to hear. And then, as Julia mentioned before, they're jumping on it to supersize the weapons industry in their mind, in perpetuity. And also, I don't know if Julie really got into this yet, but all these special favors they want, and they're using Ukraine as the rationale.
And the more that they lobby, the more that they consolidate their power, and not just their power over members of Congress in terms of, the financial conflicts of interest that they entangle members in, whether it be, because members own and trade stocks in those defense companies, or because, they accept campaign contributions from those companies. They're going to be more receptive to those companies' lobbyists. And it also contributes to the consolidation of the industry. We see that lobbyists have successfully influenced Congress to create a lot of exemptions to contracting regulations that are designed to prevent corporate price gouging. And as a result, lobbyists enable, their companies to price gouge, to consolidate more monopolistic power over the services that they provide the Pentagon. It really is a vicious cycle, as Bill said.
Yeah.
Basically, they're good at lobbying the government for money, not so good at producing weapons that are, functional or relevant.
Right. And it doesn't matter, because the more that they lobby Congress for money, the more that they get, regardless of their performance and transparency and, general regard for the taxpayer, I would say.
Yeah. Accountability doesn't really seem to matter in this space. But also, like, the role of the defense industrial lobbyists, like, it's why we have this financialized, capital intensive force where we buy fewer and fewer exquisite things for more and more money. And then that leads to, ironically, shortfalls in low profit, no profit production in things like ammunition that we fell short of for Ukraine. And so, like, we put ourselves into this bind of simultaneously recognizing the need to arm Ukraine, but also we want to produce things that are highest profit. And that means big platforms, not human intensive production, but labor or capital intensive production. And, like, the lobbyists help make sure that happens,
Yeah,
interest group.
they've helped create this problem. And now, a lot of the initial weapons to Ukraine came out of stocks, so they could do it quickly. They're getting to the point where they have to produce them.
Yeah.
It takes them months, sometimes years, to produce this stuff because it's so complex, and then it's hard to maintain on the battlefield. And so they're a big part of the problem, but they make it sound like it's just, give us more money.
Yeah. And they also outsource most of the actual work. It's almost like having middle management, right? Like they, the big five, the defense giants,
like subcontractors and
the subcontractors do all the work, and the government has very little insight into how primes treat their subcontractors, which I think contributes to the issue of diversifying the industry and the supply chain. And it's really a deterrent to people doing government contracting work, at least in the defense space.
Yeah. I've seen people basically read this situation, and it leads to the punchline from earlier, like, well, obviously we just need more cowbell. We just need more defense spending, and that will resolve this whole dilemma of, like, well, we've built these, like, financialized expensive platform warfighting kit, but then at the same time we need to build long-term ammunition stockpiles in various categories of ammo. And so clearly we just need to throw more money at the problem. But it's like, to some extent, you can't actually do that because you only have so many factories to produce these kinds of goods, and there's going to be trade-offs there. And so, like, do you want to optimize more for, like, bullets and bombs, or do you want to optimize more for sexy platforms. But then there's the other like bigger meta problem here is that if you are just going to do an all of the above all of the time on defense, like we're going to have all the sexy platforms and all the bullets in the universe, it's permanent military Keynesian. Like that's literally the permanent war economy, you know?
Yeah.
And if you have that, you can't just sit on it. You can't just have a perfectly preserved super machine that does war. You've got to use it. It's like overcapacity. Empires have to put overcapacity somewhere overseas. It's the same shit. You have overcapacity in weapons and bullets. You got to put that somewhere. That means you got to do wars, which means you're evil at that point. Like you're not a democracy, you know? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, also all the other tools are underdeveloped. I mean, Lockheed Martin one recent year got more than the State Department in government funding. So it doesn't make any sense, you know. I mean, granted, it's not just having money for the State Department, it's having a diplomatic strategy. But still, I mean, you know, the disparity of resources is stunning.
All the stuff we don't focus on by focusing on this. Yeah.
I mean, the military Keynesian idea that increasing military spending is good for people and the economy is just not true anymore, as you said, because spending is increasingly capital intensive. And if we're talking about labor, like it's going, you know, to procurement, to research and development, to electrical engineers with like PhDs working for Lockheed. It's not necessarily providing Americans the economic mobility that I think the military historically is perceived to provide. Like that's less and less true. And we know that not only because military participation has gone down, but like, you know, 1 in 5 military families are hungry. Military housing was one of the biggest contentious debates in the NDAA this year. It's insane. And the more money that we spend, the more opportunity companies have to push their luck, right? I mean, the Senate Armed Services Committee Personnel Subcommittee had a hearing last week, and some of the highlights are, you know, TRICARE health program. The Defense Department is spending $1,500 on breast pumps that you can buy at Walmart for $192. Like that's what we're getting.
Yeah. Bill, you good?
I had a thought which is escaping me, but it should come back.
Okay. The thing I wanted to poke you guys both on is like, what are ways out of this nightmare, right? Like, can you talk about some of the ideas that you guys have written about this, like over the years, how to curb U.S. defense spending, how to rein in this problem? Like, what are some potential solutions?
Yeah, I think it operates on 2 levels. You know, one is like what policies would help do this.
Mm-hmm.
Then the second is in this actual political climate that we're in, how would you get support for them? So, you know, it's easier to lay out policies and figure out how to get support for them in this horrific political climate. But I think in terms of policies, you would want to curb the revolving door. If you can't shut it altogether, make them wait 5 years so their contacts are cold, make them report on what they're doing, include more people within the bureaucracy. And also, it's not just when you're lobbying on the specific thing you worked on at the Pentagon, but you can't go to the boards. I mean, you know, the last 5 secretaries of defense came from the Big 5. One was head of lobbying for Raytheon. One was on the board of General Dynamics. One was a 30-year executive at Boeing. You know, so from the top down, you've got this influence, and it goes both ways. Companies into government people to the companies. So I think that's important. I think campaign reform would help, but I don't think that's their biggest tool. I think their biggest tool is the revolving door and the jobs argument. And so the jobs argument is tougher because you would need an industrial policy, which is a dirty word in large parts of the country. You can have an industrial policy for the Pentagon, but you can't have one to develop solar or build a housing industry. So I think that would have to change because, as Julia said, you can get many more jobs with other kinds of investments. But, you know, the hawks say, well, you know, our country is built on providing the national defense. That's the only thing the federal government has to do. So obviously they don't read very well because there was also promoting the general welfare, but that's further down in the sentence. So I think, and the thing is, as a jobs thing, it's diminishing returns. Even the National Defense Industrial Association, which is the big, kind of trade association for the weapons industry, does these things called vital signs, the state of the industry. And they said, well, there were 3.2 million direct jobs in the 1980s in weapons manufacturing. Now it's 1.1 million. So it's partly because they're building fewer units, they're using more high-tech employees, they're outsourcing, they're mechanizing. So it's going to be harder for them to make the case to every member and every senator that this is good for your state or district. But it will take, I think, some government intervention, and that's the tough sell in our politics. But Miriam Pemberton has a wonderful book about kind of the history of efforts to do conversion, even in this climate that we have. And there's been some promising examples, but the government never came behind that with enough investment money to make it work.
I have that book, and I was going to hold it up, but it's like 6 stops on the road to defense conversion or something along those lines. It's very good. Yeah.
So the underlying problem, though, is a lot of people don't know this, or they may know it and they say, well, the power's too much, I'm just going to take care of my family. Or I can't influence the government at all on any issue. So why would I stick my neck out on this one? So I think there's a lot about reviving our politics across the board that would be necessary to make a dent on this issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have a lot of faith in the Zoomers. I think that they're going to deliver on making cutting Pentagon spending a little bit more compelling. I get that folks have so many things to deal with. They can't afford their prescription drugs and education and all that. The military-industrial-congressional complex is not top of mind for most of us. But I completely agree with Bill that slowing down the revolving door is really critical to getting at some of these budget issues and cutting Pentagon waste. I think we should strengthen recusal requirements for DoD officials so that they, can't award contracts to the contractors that they used to work for. I think that is a major reason why service contracting has, more than doubled in the past 25 years. It exceeded like $205 billion in 2022, which is insane. We know that service contracting is wasteful. We know that from the war on terror. It continues to be. Extending the cooling off period for folks leaving government and then, going to private industry the other way around. They shouldn't be able to go use their contacts and make money for themselves and for the corporations that they work for. Eliminating UPLs is an easy one. The Pentagon supports it. It's billions of dollars every single year that Congress tends to be pretty receptive to. Again, we can't exactly match up all of the Pentagon budget increases to UPL requests because they're so private, but that seems like a good place to start considering that the Secretary of Defense is with it. And I've talked a little bit about, price gouging and sort of defense consolidation and its role in companies overcharging the government and the taxpayer and often sidelining the small businesses that do the majority of the work. There is good policy in place. There are just so many carve-outs that contracting regulation doesn't operate as intended to prevent this type of overcharging, in part because Congress, again, has bent to the will of contractors with whom they have many, many conflicts of interest, whether they be financial or campaign related, or this district level jobs argument that we see every campaign cycle. So, it requires a multifaceted approach. And we have a multi-layered approach from our community of budget folks working on cutting the defense budget, and hopefully we get somewhere. I do think that we're making progress.
I think one other positive thing is there's a lot of veterans groups taking on these issues. Veterans for Peace, Common Defense, About Face. The generals are going to work for the companies, but a lot of the people who fought the wars, who've seen the machine from the inside, are taking on the Pentagon. So I think they're huge valuable allies in all of this. And even on the conservative side, I think the politicians have been all over the map. We're fiscal conservatives, except they're not following through on those promises. But I think, the reason Trump was railing about the Iraq War, he called the companies greedy. He said it's crazy to spend this much on the Pentagon. Was not because he believed it, because what does he believe? But I think he thought part of the base could be motivated by that. So there may be a way to reach some of those folks. I mean, the problem is, who do you want to work with? I mean, a lot of these people have serious baggage, like, they don't support democracy. So there's limits to that kind of strange bedfellows coalition. But I think there are some people out there who might be reached.
Yeah, you guys have made a number of great points here. I'm a little more optimistic after talking to you, and I'm glad you guys are fighting the good fight. Hopefully Gen Z can get in there too. Great points about veterans being on the right side of this. And yeah, maybe we just need to politicize this more. There's a lot there is a consciousness issue in the sense that like people don't necessarily connect gratuitous defense spending to the ability to afford prescription drugs, but like the ability to subsidize prescription drugs depends on having a federal budget that has that discretion to do that. And you can't do that when the discretionary budget's eaten up by the Pentagon. I mean, like it's a problem. Yeah. Connecting these dots is a big deal.
And if I might,
go ahead.
If I might make one final point, talking about prescription drugs, talking about contractors price gouging, I think folks, young people in particular, as a self-identified Zillennial myself, I think that we care about corporate accountability. And I think that that's the through line. And it's one that I am struggling to make, but I really try to draw that connection where I can, where we have monopolistic power, working for the benefit of the very few to the detriment of the many.
Well, Julia's a millennial, and I've been around for millennia, so we're on the same page. But I think, part of it too is people just feel like, well, it's like an insurance policy. Let's just spend a little more. And since they don't fully grasp the corruption, the fact that the strategy is more likely to get us into wars than protect us, all these things have to be elevated. And in the media environment that we have, it's very difficult. But I think, we have to build up independent media and at least get headlines in the mainstream media so people realize there's other points of view out there as part of this.
Yeah, no, totally agree. All right. You guys have been awesome. Thank you for this. The piece in the Nation and Tom Dispatch was called "The Pentagon Won Big with the Debt Ceiling Bill." Bill Hartung, Julia Gledhill, thanks for coming on the show, guys.
Yeah, this was great. Not everybody goes into this level of detail, so it's fun.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. Take care, folks.
You as well.